And from John Malden via maldeneconomics.com, brought to you by Zero Hedge. Social Security means, Social Security means testing looms. It's impossible without a 50% income tax hike. And we're talking about tax cuts, right? The projected total U.S. debt will be $30 trillion within 10 years, using the CBO's own numbers. And by the way, if you looked at the CBO's own numbers prior to 2008, they wouldn't have told you, by 2016, 17, we were going to see $20 trillion in debt. See, that wasn't their own number until the crisis happened, right? So could there maybe be another crisis, economic crisis, over the next 10 years? Is one probable? Of course there is. So 30 trillion might not be nothing. Might be 40, who knows? But the CBO also makes the rosy assumptions that there will be no recessions and that GDP will grow at a 4% nominal rate. Yet we revised 10 years of GDP last year. Revised it all to like 1 point something, 2 point something, back to 1 point something. Horrible. This is like the pension Ponzi scheme. Yeah, we expect 8% returns every single year forever. And in that case, your pension will be funded. Okay, but that never happens. And things go down and the pensions have been sucking. And yeah, we don't have the money. Massive pension problem imploding as we speak, which I've been covering as well. All over the place. That is pensions. Now that's possible, we could see 4%. I'm inclined to haircut it a bit, he says. If you ask me to bet the over-under on the debt in 2027, I would bet the over at $35 trillion mark. After the next recession, the deficit will be $30 trillion within 4 to 5 years, and then grow from there at a rate of anywhere from $1.5 to $2 trillion per year. And I covered this in my team's calculations in this letter he links to. Is it any wonder why I'm so concerned about pensions? Speaking of pensions, great. Social Security is impossible under this deficit. Note, this is not the CBO's projected debt. It does not take into account the off-budget deficit that still ends up having to be borrowed. Last year, the deficit was well over $1 trillion, but we were told it was in the neighborhood of $600 billion. If any normal company tried to use accounting like this, like the U.S. Congress does, the Securities and Exchange Commission would rightly declare it fraudulent and shut it down immediately. Here's a chart from the Treasury's annual financial report, projecting government receipts and spending, which I'm not going to show this. Note that this chart expresses the various items of percentages of GDP, not in dollars. So the relatively flat spending categories simply mean that they are forecasted to grow in line with the economy or just a little faster. But the space representing net interest grows much faster than GDP does, fast enough to make total federal spending add up to 1/3 of GDP by 2090. Obviously, this chart is based on all kinds of assumptions, kind of like that pension 8% assumption, right? And reality will be far different. I doubt we will make it to 2090 or even 2050 without at least one global depression or other calamity that radically resets all the assumptions. Beneficial changes are also possible. Biotech breakthroughs that reduce healthcare expenditures, for instance. Still looking at the demographic reality of longer lifespans and lower birth rates, it's hard to believe Social Security can survive over the long run in anything like its present form. But any major change will mean that the government is breaking its promise to the workers and retirees. How will we fund the deficit and fulfill the pensions? And now we come to the really uncomfortable part. Larry Kotlikoff wrote in an article on Forbes that we would need an immediate, approximately 50% increase in taxes to fund our future deficits. That's what we would need to create a true entitlements lockbox with the funds actually in it. But surely everybody knows by now that there is no lockbox with Social Security funds in it. That money was spent on other government programs and debts. And so when the CBO doesn't count the trust funds as part of the national debt, they are not only being disingenuous, I think they are committing financial fraud. The money that will actually pay for Social Security and Medicare down the road is going to have to come out of future taxes, just like or just as for any other debt of the U.S. So at some point, even though Republicans are jawboning hard about cutting taxes now, we are going to have to raise taxes in order to fund Social Security and Medicare. I personally think it will have to be done with a value-added tax or VAT tax, because the necessary increase in income taxes would totally destroy the economy and potential growth. And yes, I know some of you will write back and say we had much higher tax rates in the 50s and we had good growth then. But our demographics and productivity levels are completely different in that era, or were. Plus, nobody actually paid the highest tax levels. I remember that in the 80s, before the Reagan tax cuts, I had so many deductions that my effective tax rate was about 15%. The irony is that after the Reagan tax cuts, my total tax payments went up, not down. I lost all of my cool deductions. Ah, the good old days. But the simple fact of the matter is that no Congress is going to fund Social Security and Medicare through tax hikes. Before they ever go there, they will means test Social Security and increase the retirement age, which they should. Of course, Congress could always, well, he says of course they should, I don't think they should. Of course, Congress could always authorize the Treasury Department to authorize the Federal Reserve to monetize a certain amount of the Social Security and Medicare debt, which is essentially what Japan is doing and seemingly getting away with it. I think we should all be grateful to the Japanese for being willing to undertake such a fascinating experiment in monetary and fiscal policy. Let me close with a quick sidebar note. I think the Fed's mad rush to raise rates and reduce its balance sheet at the same time is unwise. I mean seriously, is the Federal Reserve balance sheet making that much of a difference to the U.S. economy? Perhaps when that extraordinary balance sheet was created, it did, but not today. This is one of those times when I think our policymakers should go slowly and tread carefully. I'm just saying. And let's think about that for a second. Remember Ben Bernanke? I've talked about this quite a few times now recently. When he was in charge of the Federal Reserve and the balance sheet was going from 600 billion or 500 billion, wherever it was at, it started to climb towards that 4.5 trillion where it currently sits at. He said back then, years ago, this is only temporary. It will come back down to normal. And we penned that in around, again, I forget the year. He said either 2015 or 2016, like by January 2015 or 2016. And I said, okay, well, let's see how that goes. And he left office. Now Janet Yellen has replaced him. And there's still a $4.5 trillion balance sheet. Hasn't been touched. And now he's coming out, as I've said, I've been following him, blogging, talking. You know, on second thought, maybe we don't have to unwind, as they say. Maybe we don't have to unwind the balance sheet. The dog with you? Yeah. Oh, he's going to be very dusty in here. So let him stay out there from the floor. So, yeah, so now it's okay. Now he's saying, hey, let's just, matter of fact, and he said this, as a matter of fact, if it needs to go higher, so what? Let it go higher. It's not hurting anything. Well, it's not hurting anything if we're not paying interest on that money. But I haven't ever heard an answer to that from anybody. Are we making interest payments to the Federal Reserve essentially on its balance sheet, as opposed to people who buy our treasuries or countries who buy our treasuries and we pay them the interest on it? Which is another side story we could get into. Why are we paying anybody money, interest, to print our own flipping money? We should be printing it ourselves. We have the means. We just make the Treasury print bonds for the equal amount and then we attach interest to it. But the interest is never printed. So how can it ever be paid off? That's the question. How can it ever be paid off? debt, and I'm talking our country's debt, if every dollar they create has interest attached to it, and you don't start off with any money, you borrow it right off the bat. You borrow it into existence. You can never have a net cash flow or net positive above what's borrowed. You're going to have to borrow more money to pay back the previously owed money, and all the while compounding interest. So again, how do they fix it? The only way they can fix this is to stop the whole interest thing, get rid of the interest. Maybe they'll come to that conclusion one day. I don't know about that though. I wouldn't hold my breath. So anyways, take care.